Me. Okay. Welcome to this last session of the seminar that we prepared together. So it's a seminar organized by Agora, Research Center of UCY, so Sergi University, okay, and also ICT, which is one of the numerous labs of the Faculté des Lettres et Langues de the University of Tours. We have the great pleasure today to welcome Laurence Harris. So I must say that this seminar has been prepared and organized by Catherine Marshall, who is online at the moment. She's from Agora, and also by Stéphan Porion, who is also online and who is from ICT. So they're not here today with us, physically speaking, but they're with us online. So welcome, Laurence. Laurence Harris is a senior lecturer at the University Sorbonne Nouvelle and a member of Champroux, Center for Research on the English-speaking World. Her research focuses on British institutions, in particular the Bank of England and the BBC. Laurence was one of the founders of the Sorbonne Alliance project Finance and Society, supported by Université Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne, ESCP Business School and University Sorbonne Nouvelle. She recently co-organized an international conference I attended, which was very good, where speakers including central bank representatives and academics discussing the subject of central banks and the common good. She is going today to present her research on a huge period of time about Britain's relationship with finance, from Bagehot to Brexit and bowler hats to blockchain, how a blend of conservatism and liberalism has shaped British society through its financial sector. We hope you can see the PowerPoint you prepared. And we also hope you will be able to hear what you will say. You have 40 to 45 minutes. I'll stop you.
Sounds good.
And we'll have an exchange with the room and with the people online. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nathalie.
You must verify they can see you. Oops. Okay. Yes. Stabilizing things.
So, just working out.
Anything?
Trying my...
Just here.
Right. Good afternoon. By way of an introduction to this talk on UK finance, here is an extract from a Treasury Select Committee hearing back in 2012. To give you some context, Bob Diamond, Barclays CEO, for only 1 year, had resigned the day before following controversy over interest rate manipulation known as the LIBOR scandal. In this rather brutal exchange, Bob Diamond is reminded that Barclays was originally founded by Quakers in the 17th century and inherited as a result an image of trustworthiness, frugality and prudence, all seemingly unknown to Barclays CEO. Similar paradoxes are found with the LMX spiral and its impact on the names at Lloyd's, the insurer. That was a long way from the aspirations of Edward Lloyd in his coffee house, which opened in the city to provide shipping news, then maritime insurance. The Edward Lloyd who left the lease of his coffee house to his head waiter. We could also mention Royal Bank of Scotland, founded in Edinburgh, when Edinburgh stood at the centre of European Enlightenment. That was again in the 18th century. RBS collapsed in 2009 after a number of strategic errors under the watch of Fred Goodwin, leading to what remains to date the largest corporate failure in UK history. So these stories provide a brief insight into some of the roots and origins of UK finance. And whilst finance has evolved over 300 years, its role remains as fundamental as ever. It has survived the upheavals of history, the forces of liberalism and conservatism, and adapted as well as shaped society along the way. So the story of finance, as we'll see, is also one of key individuals. Perhaps let's first examine a few figures on finance today to get the measure of its place in the UK economy. In 2023, UK financial and professional services produced 13% of the economic output of the UK. These services paid 13% of the UK's tax contribution. The UK was the largest net exporter of financial services worldwide in 2022. As a global hub for financial and related services, the city alone provides 1 million jobs in finance. All these figures you'll find on the city website, because the city is more than a county or a district in London. It is a corporation with its own charter, Lord Mayor, and government, which is the oldest in the country with origins predating Parliament. And because of the contribution of the city to the UK economy is disproportionate relative to its size, the city has largely been left alone protecting its ancient liberties, as stated in Magna Carta. So the outline of today's talk includes first a brief look at markets and market participants in UK finance from their origins, then an insight into the workings of the Bank of England and the evolution of its remit, and finally a look at more recent events impacting UK finance. First, markets and market participants, starting with a mix of entrepreneurship and projects. In the age of projects in the late 17th and early 18th century, private investors embarked upon many ambitious projects in trade and infrastructure. The era witnessed a surge in the constructions of roads, canals, bridges, ports. These projects were crucial for facilitating trade and laying the groundwork for economic growth. So in his essay upon projects in 1697, Daniel Defoe describes the 1690s as the projecting age. The historian Colin Nicholson observes there was a rush of projects in the period preceding the collapse of the South Sea Company. Defoe himself dabbled in various entrepreneurial ventures, and this was his definition of a project, a vast undertaking, too big to be managed and therefore likely to come to nothing. The financing of these large-scale projects involved the creation of joint stock companies, where investors pooled their capital together to fund ventures. Now, the joint stock company suffered a temporary setback because of the disasters of the South Sea Bubble and the Mississippi Company, its fall, which brought the model into disrepute and ushered in the Bubble Act, 1720. The Bubble Act prohibited the joint stock company unless it was specifically authorised by royal charter. But that law was repealed in 1825, and that allowed for the rapid explosion of joint stock companies in Victorian times. So these events altered the political economy of England and educated a political generation into the money markets. The City of London established its mark with the creation of a number of markets and exchanges. So the market served a commercial purpose, financing global trade. The Royal Exchange, established by Thomas Gresham with its motto, that notion of fair play, my word is my bond. Many of these markets are still in existence. The London Metal Exchange has an open outcry, the last remaining in Europe. Life is one of the later additions in the 1980s. So the 18th century exchanges were self-regulated. Many operated like closed shops. They were fairly clubbish. The London Stock Exchange did not accept women trading on the floor until 1973. Another significant trait of the age of projects was the financing of colonial ventures. Companies such as the East India Company, also involved in the slave trade, were granted charters to establish colonies and trade routes. When it comes to the geography of finance, London is a tale of two cities. The separation of the city from the rest of the country actually goes back to the Norman conquest that gave the merchants of London a limited autonomy. William the Conqueror built his first residence, the Tower of London, on the outskirts of the city. And to this day, monarchs, if they wish to enter the square mile, need to stop and request permission from the Lord Mayor. This takes place at Temple Bar. That's where the Strand becomes Fleet Street. And where you find the courts of justice, they often had to mediate between the government and financial institutions. So West versus East London, West End banks lent on mortgage and had many landed families as clients, and city banks purchased bills of exchange and serviced the world of trade. But the geography of finance also takes us outside London, as the banks that clustered in Lombard Street also were deposit banks for other banks in the country in rural England. So they facilitated mercantile credit, which was a lucrative business. So what we had was an increasingly enmeshed web of bankers and merchants enjoying a mutually beneficial relationship. Now, the story of merchant banking is also the story of families and names shaping the city during wars and 19th century empire expansion. Two families in particular stand out, the Barings and the Rothschilds. Both families have German ancestry. They were initially merchant families in the wool and textile business. UK finance has been dominated at different times by dynastic conservatism. These families were like clubs. Again, a host of new entrants arrive. Here's the list there. Round about 1800 to 1809, during wartime years, the Schroeder family was from Hamburg. They also left continental Europe for the expertise that was building in London. They found there a critical mass of support facilities. So these families were able to move closer to the traditional landed governing class with access to power. The aristocracy let in the men of finance, well, some of them anyway. In 1885, Nathan Rothschild and Ned Baring were made peers as Lord Rothschild and Lord Revelstoke. They were close to Gladstone, yet within a year they would abandon Gladstone over Home Rule. Moving on to the divisive question of the Corn Laws. In 1843, actually a city by-election was fought on that issue. So the Anti-Corn Law League won against Tom Baring, who was the protectionist on the occasion. And in fact, the city gradually shifted to the Tory vote. And by 1885, it was a Tory stronghold. The 1885 election was fought mostly on Joseph Chamberlain's radical programme, and both city seats fell to the Conservatives. That was the imperial dimension of Chamberlain's programme that appealed to merchant bankers. So the city retained its free trading allegiance, but at the same time was happy with the status quo. And this conservatism is related to this dislike of sudden change. It is detrimental to commerce. So as for the city's influence on politicians, it remained limited because the British governments pursued national interests and the city pursued international interests. There is another side of finance that relied on the concept of mutual aid. It developed in working class culture outside London, in the Midlands and the north of England. Mutual associations are one of the oldest types of finance operations, offering their members a wide range of affordable savings, investments, insurances, pensions. Profits would not go to the shareholders, but the policyholders. Building societies as an institution began in late 18th century Birmingham, a town which was undergoing rapid economic and physical expansion driven by a multiplicity of small metalworking firms. Many of the early building societies were based in taverns and coffee houses. These developed as part of a movement known as the Midlands Enlightenment, with the exchange of ideas among Birmingham's highly active citizens. The Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers, for the full name, founded in 1844, was an early consumers' cooperative famous for designing the Rochdale Principles. These principles provide today the foundation on which many co-ops around the world operate to this day, including open membership, democratic control, political neutrality, religious neutrality, and the cooperative bank was established in Manchester following these principles laid by the Rochdale pioneers. Friendly societies started to emerge during the Industrial Revolution and were officially recognised by the UK government in 1875. But they started earlier as informal groups and networks coming together to save money collectively. Some catered for women only, although the treasurers were always male. They were concerned with the moral well-being, some of them, as well as the financial well-being. That was the case for the Hampshire Friendly Society. Looked into moral well-being as well as the financial well-being of its working class members. So these multiplied throughout the 19th century and declined with the rise of the welfare state when the government took over many of their functions, which extended to sick aid. As for building societies, many were demutualized in the wake of reforms following the 1986 Big Bang, to which I will return. And one last word on the countervailing forces of prudence. Now, the age of projects saw innovation in financial instruments, in a rapidly growing securities market, and specifically government bonds emerged at that time, known as treasuries or gilts, because of the gilt-aged paper they were printed on. UK gilts were and are considered a very safe form of investment, and the British government has never failed to make any payments to its lenders on issued gilts. This is what you can read today on the website of the Debt Management Office. The UK retains its AA rating. The Victorian essayist and economist Walter Bagehot, who saw himself as a conservative liberal, described the money market in Lombard Street. He wrote it in 1873. He discusses at length in Lombard Street the demise of Paris, as a counterweight to London, the city's assets, but also its liabilities. Essentially what he says in his pithy style is money will not manage itself, and he calls the Bank of England amateurs. Now, the Bank of England were a private bank at the time, and let's now turn to its roles and power. So first, it was a Whig creation. The Bank of England was the foremost project of the projecting age, one of the first British shareholding organisations to offer limited liability. Interestingly, the bank was established almost by sleight of hand by this new rising class of opportunistic merchants. The bank emerged in 1694 from the momentous changes of the Glorious Revolution. The new monarchs, William and Mary, took over a virtually bankrupt government, and they needed money fast, desperately. They needed to put down the rebellion of supporters of James II. They needed to wage war in France and to protect trade routes. And so the Scottish financier William Pattison projected the bank they needed using trickery, which provides a good example of the buccaneering spirit of the age. As he had already attempted and failed to get a project off the ground this time, Pattison hid the creation of a new bank in a bill which managed to pass through both houses of Parliament. The interest on the loan was to be paid out of levies on the ship's tonnage, hence the name, the Tonnage Act. So the proposal for this new bank was slipped in under the disguise of taxes on wine and beer. And this is how the national debt was invented. It was a bank of credit initially. This new bank also managed to finagle further privileges, such as the right to issue legal tender. And the charter, the very first Bank of England charter, is a surprisingly egalitarian document declaring that the subscription would be open to all, natives and foreigners, body politic and corporate. So the Bank of England was a progressive project, a Whig institution that the landed gentry saw initially as a threat to their power. The Bank of England had many enemies, including many alternative banks supported by the Tories, the Land Bank, the South Sea Company, where the original capital was entirely fictitious, the East India Company. They all failed where the Bank of England succeeded. Goldsmiths as well. Parliament also saw the bank as a threat to their power, but Pattison had thought of everything, and Parliament was appeased by the insertion of a clause that the bank could not provide funds for the king without its assent. So the idea that this bank had to be projected, given some reality, that was achieved through the power of naming, intentional naming. The bank name is, as you see at the bottom of the slide here, the governor and company of the Bank of England. You can still read this on sterling banknotes to this day, if you look closely. So it was given two powerful points of reference from the start. First, the figure of a governor. That's a reassuring one. And that was needed to personalize this level of risk and uncertainty. And second, choosing England and not London was a stroke of genius, because banks at the time usually chose and bore the name of the city of their founding, such as Amsterdam, Genoa. But that way it was given the authority of the nation, and that helped it fend off competition from, for example, from UK banks such as the Bank of Bristol. At the same time creating that nation. So that name sounded reliable and enduring and lent it credibility, at least if you were English. So the national debt grew inexorably. The bank then not only managed the debt, but also became a government bank. This is what Adam Smith and Lord North said about it. In 1844, Parliament passed the Bank Charter Act, or Peel Act, that gave the bank a virtual monopoly on the right to issue banknotes in the UK. So now sterling reigned as the most steadfast currency in the world. And the Bank of England became the prototype of the centralized national bank emulated by other central banks around the world. Yet until 1997, the bank's responsibilities remain fairly broad and informal, as former Governor Mark Carney observes. A rich history of law, principle and convention. So eyebrows and invented traditions. The eyebrows to which I refer here are the governor's eyebrows, presumably first those of Montagu Norman, the architect of the modern Bank of England. He stayed 24 years at the helm. That's quite a record, from 1920 to 1944. His motto was never apologize, never explain, and secrecy was a tool of central banking. So the governor's eyebrows were a form of informal regulation, signaling authority and meant to keep financial actors on their toes when the city was essentially a domestic community. Up until the 1960s, the bank's communication remained opaque and amounted to a single speech delivered annually by the governor to the bankers and merchants of the City of London at the Lord Mayor's Mansion House banquet. Bankers' Banquet. The Mansion House sits literally opposite the Bank of England on Bank Junction. I have spent some time studying this event, its setting and its ritual, because it survives today and contributes to the creation of the social reality of the financial sector and of the Bank of England. According to Bagehot, who wrote the English Constitution 6 years prior to Lombard Street, ritual belongs to the dignified parts of the Constitution, that of royalty, which complements the efficient parts, that of government. Catherine Marshall explores deference to the Constitution as a concept and a political force. Hierarchical, voluntary deference combines rational and irrational elements. This provides a better understanding of the present Constitution. And there is certainly mystery, symbolism, and theatricality on the event, the Bankers' Banquet. Interestingly, this seemingly ancient ritual only dates back to 1877, which raises the possibility that this event might yet be another invented tradition, a concept that was made popular by Hobsbawm and Ranger, who examined traditions that were forged in the second half of the 19th century, even though they appear or claim to be older. So they observe that the tradition of and rituals of that period often emerge in response to times of crisis or new situations. And that enables the institution to gain legitimacy by referring to the past. Post-nationalisation, the Mansion House speeches are a bellwether not only of the British economy, but also of society's relationship with finance. There is humour, whereas, for instance, with Lord Cato's homage to Keynes in 1946, my Lord Mayor cannot speak tonight without reference to the grievous loss this country and the world has sustained by the untimely death of my friend Lord Keynes. He had a delightful gift of epigram, and I well remember when the Labour government came into power, his remark that the head of the governor of the Bank of England would be cut off and then firmly planted back again on his shoulders with a slight turn to the left. But there is mostly gloom, governor's gloom, as Callaghan said in the post-war speeches. Many resemble sermons. Bankers and the British public are urged to exercise restraint because of the growing deficit in the balance of payments. I see no cause to cheer, Lord Cobbold, my unhappiness about government expenditure, Leslie O'Brien. People everywhere long to end the humiliation of our decline, Gordon Richardson. The relationship between governors and chancellors of the Exchequer was at times strained. And overall, the conversation was easier with Conservative rather than Labour prime ministers. The clashes between the very patrician Lord Cromer, himself from the Baring family, and Harold Wilson belonged to folklore. As regards ideology, apart from a 19th century debate on the currency school versus the banking school, the bank remained neutral, above party politics. And if the bank has been seen as a conservative institution with a small c in its recent history, it's because it has sought to protect itself from becoming an adjunct to the Treasury or a branch office of the ECB, in the words of one governor. It managed to survive nationalisation relatively unscathed, as you can see the remit remaining suitably vague at the time. In a previous lecture, Peter Dorey discussed Thatcherism with its emphasis on the primacy of the individual. Big Bang was actually a term coined by a director of the Bank of England, and it referred to the deregulation, liberalisation and digitalisation of the UK financial services. So for British citizens, this meant being able to take currency abroad without restrictions. That's the removal of exchange controls in '79. They could borrow more freely as credit allocation was also deregulated. And they also massively acquired shares in the newly privatised gas and electricity utilities, and council tenants were able to acquire their properties. The bank survived the ERM crisis. Maastricht spelled a possible loss or dilution of monetary sovereignty to the ECB. The Mansion House speeches turned more Eurosceptic. Opt-outs were secured. So the bank has remained all round a conservative institution. We'll discuss independence. In fact, its more operational responsibility in 1997. New Labour effectively neutered the Bank of England. But yes, a conservative institution. The governors have all been British, white males, apart from Carney, who was Canadian. So centralisation, scandals, and lack of diversity have attracted various forms of protest to the city in more recent times. This coincides with the onset of a populist phase in UK politics, which may have abated. Perhaps I should have added a cautious question mark to the title of this final section. Let's start with finance v. industry. For most of the 19th century, British industry had little to do with the city. It's perhaps typical that David Ricardo never visited the industrial Midlands or the North. Although, as we saw, merchant banking initially merged finance and industry, the two were subsequently often pitched against each other. Winston Churchill famously said, "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more." Content, I need to check this. The 1980s are the era of popular capitalism. In the city, the old merchant banks were taken over by more aggressive American and Japanese investment banks, and a new futures market life opened in the old Royal Exchange, modelled on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Margaret Thatcher herself actually distanced herself from this new phenomenon of wealth display and city bonuses. The financialization of the UK economy was the result of the growing influence of financial markets in shaping economic decisions, resource allocation, social dynamics, which we see everywhere today in education, the NHS, the BBC. Interestingly, if there is one high growth industry where the UK is leading the way today, ranking only second to the US, it is fintech, financial technology. There's one area which has seen growing political tensions, and that's currency issues, which have come to dominate two recent referenda in the UK. These two referenda have shaped and polarised opinion. The governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, actually contributed to the Scottish independence debate. His advice was that Scotland would not be able to remain in a currency union with the UK if it were to leave the UK. So the central bank for the whole of the UK is not called the Bank of England for nothing. The power of naming, as discussed earlier. So currency concerns were therefore decisive in swaying Scotland's vote to stay in the UK. UKIP adopted the sterling symbol as part of its logo to symbolise its emphasis on the UK's economic independence and currency sovereignty. Again, such strategic branding resonated with core supporters. And the next challenge to that sovereignty, that currency sovereignty, is virtual. The rise of the blockchain since the advent of Bitcoin in 2009 has led to the proliferation of cryptocurrencies. Rather crypto assets, that would be the more accurate word, because they're not really used as a means of exchange, but for ease of understanding, we'd use cryptocurrencies. They are advocated by libertarians on a global scale. They are decentralized. There's no central authority like the Bank of England to stabilize their value. And because they are a threat to fiat currencies like sterling, the Bank of England is currently working on its answer to cryptocurrencies in the form of CBDC, central bank digital currencies. But crucially, unlike cryptocurrencies, CBDC transactions are not anonymous, but subject to government monitoring, which means brakes may be applied by conservative and liberal motives alike. Such issues are debated in Parliament. However, there has been a growing sense in the UK since the global financial crisis that many momentous decisions were taken by unelected power, to borrow the title of a seminal publication by Paul Tucker, former director of the Bank of England. He warned that democracy in the UK was, I quote, flirting with a peculiar cocktail of hyper-depoliticized technocracy and hyper-politicized populism, each fueling the other in attempts to maintain effective government. And finance has often been the target of protest. Invectives against the financial elite or the establishment are nothing new. The city has been at the centre of major hostile protests before, with the Gordon riots in 1780, the Chartists in 1848, the Occupy movement in 2012. But the financial establishment is rarely challenged from inside the political sphere. However, the Brexit campaign unleashed a wave of populism, not just anti-elitism, but also anti-pluralism and anti-liberalism against experts, stoked by the likes of Farage, Rees-Mogg, Johnson, Gove. As Jan Werner Müller observes, the irony was that Gove himself clearly had the authority of an expert. So unelected power is nothing new, but central banking is now part of that story. Yet the governor of the Bank of England, who'd been accused of being a Remainer, of submitting incorrect forecasts, etc., was the only voice of authority, and in fact the only leader, full stop, in the chaos that ensued on the morning of 17 June 2016, the day after the referendum vote, as he addressed the nation. This wave of populism was coupled with a crisis of representation. The 2019 Mansion House speech was interrupted by Greenpeace protesters, who were all women dressed in suffragette evening wear, originally an intra-establishment protest. They disrupted the banquet in order to express their dismay at the lack of diversity in the persons of the Chancellor and the Governor, and to read an alternative speech focusing on a greener agenda. So as the populist moment passed, leaders are shaped by what precedes them. Rishi Sunak is no Johnson. Starmer's post-populist pitch in January was a promise of restored institutions. The same applies to Rachel Reeves in a May's lecture. promoting rational deference to the institutions and to the constitution. Interestingly, she chose to start the year with the Mays Lecture, which is a lecture created in 1977 in the city. And the first speakers were all governors of the Bank of England. So a mistrust of elite and depressed living standards still prevails in Britain, but this does not appear so far to feed the ranks of Reform UK. Certainly a new post-Brexit world is emerging in the UK, with finance still central to the economy, and political deference having to adapt this time to a digital age. So, concluding on UK finance, which remains riven with paradoxes. We've seen the UK as a nation whose financial sector embraced the single market, but whose political leaders rejected the single currency, home to the Barings, Rothschilds, Quakers, and the Mutuals movements, the country of Big Bank, the Wimbledonization of the city, but whose taxpayers bail out its leading banks, a unique mixture of parochialism, internationalism, liberalism, conservatism, occasionally socialism, a country bound by its own currency and home to the world's largest foreign exchange markets, and whose constituent nations continue to divide over Brexit. Most importantly of all, what would Bagehot have made of today? I leave the last word to him. This is a quote from Lombard Street. You might as well, or better, try to alter the English monarchy and substitute a republic as to alter the present constitution of the English money market. Thank you for listening.
Your presentation. I will need some time to. Okay, I will need some time to close everything.
Oh, sorry, there was a reference list.
Oh, yes, there was.
Yeah.
You showed me.
No, you may.
Okay. So let's have a quick look at the reference. Anyway, as you know, all the videos of the seminars are available on YouTube and on the channel of Agora, and we give in every announcement we give the link, so do not hesitate to have a look, and then you will have all the references. I'm going to close this. I don't really know what's going to happen if I do this, but I'm sure that my friends in Tours will manage to. Yes, here we are, both of us. My friends in Tours in the video department will manage to make a very nice video from the mess I'm going to give them. So thank you very much for your presentation, which was really really interesting and stimulating. I have several questions.
Let's go.
Of course. You mentioned the relationship between the Treasury and the Bank of England, and the fact that from your presentation, what we understand is that the bank gained in terms of power and kept its independence. It's not public. And of course, when it was made completely independent in 1997, this autonomy or independence grew. On the other hand, if I remember correctly, the government still has the power to change the role of the Bank of England. Its role at the moment, if we think about monetary policy, which is what I'm interested in,
Right.
If we think about monetary policy, the Bank of England has the role to implement the policy of the government, and the policy of the government is to have inflation remaining around 2%. And provided that inflation is around 2%, going on helping with the objectives of the government, which are growth and unemployment. And the Treasury, the government has a right to change that. So they they've never changed it since 1997. They could have during the financial crisis and several crises and recessions. The governments did not, but they still have this power. So let's imagine in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, there's a new government in the UK which would decide to completely change the role of the Bank of England. Do you think that would still be possible? Or not really, because it's too like a new piece of convention or a new piece of law inside or on the top of all the others in the constitution, and it's been adopted like this. So no, it will not change. And of course, my question is also relevant for finance. The Bank of England has a role in finance supervision, regulation, and control. And this has changed, or this changed. So sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes it was all given to an independent body and then back to the Bank of England. And so again, could that once more completely change? Or is it now all, let's say, fixed inside this Norwegian constitution?
Nothing is ever fixed with the UK constitution. Right. If we go back to 1997, which was the true, major change in the bank's history, and its so-called independence, for lack of a better word, more operational autonomy. It comes as part of a bigger reform, as part of new Labour reforms. And your question is prescient, because at the time the bank was not consulted by New Labour. This came as a shock. So in a way, you might think, yes, they would have wanted more autonomy and set down in rules, but the banking supervision was taken away from them. So that came as a big shock and humiliation to the bank. And in fact, the governor at the time considered resigning over this. So you're right, the executive has the upper hand. At the same time, they've never, when it comes to appointing a new governor, they take the pulse of the city. Often the city has the informal network is still there. And for a long time, access to the city was via the governor. So the governor still is still an authority, a voice in the city. As regards the bank now has emerged after, maybe again paradoxically, after the financial crisis, as having regained its power and even has more power than ever before. But compared with the Fed or the ECB, you're right that they are limited in terms of the target. The inflation target is fixed by the Treasury, 2%, but they're left with quite a large autonomy when it comes to finding the instruments to reach that 2% inflation. And usually that was done with the interest rate lowering or increasing the interest rate. But after the financial crisis, the interest rate could no longer move. They were stuck with that particular instruments. So, and this is where they had a large autonomy. They innovated with their instruments, and they launched QE. And really, the government didn't have much to do with that. But QE is now responsible for inequality, the culture wars. The fact that QE meant essentially buying government bonds on a massive scale, hoping that would redistribute wealth. But that hasn't been the effect. The effect has been that assets have increased. The money stayed in fine wine, art, in luxury goods, in property, and it hasn't trickled down. So QE is responsible for a lot of the inequality and in fact, I have a quote here from the New Statesman that said in a recent piece, the population is getting angry now, but they don't know who they should get angry at. And because it's hard to get angry at complex central bank policies, the people who were left behind in areas such as the coastal towns of Britain or the American Rust Belt got angry at something more familiar, other people. But they may not realize that at the root of this period of inequality, there's QE as an experiment by the Bank of England that failed. And in fact, we can go further. Now they've started to do the reverse, QT.
But it was all accepted by the government. The Chancellor always signed.
They let the central bank do whatever they want in terms of choosing the right instruments. And in fact, politically, they're better off stepping back and saying, well, if there's a mess, at least they're not responsible. And we had that very strange moment for democracy when we go back to Liz Truss' very short premiership. The bank was actually following QT, quantitative tightening, the reverse of QE, at the time when Liz Truss announced her policy of unfunded tax cuts. And these two collided, they unraveled, and we know what happened to her short premiership. But we had this moment of Rishi Sunak, her replacement, thanking the UK bond market for installing him as leader. Strange. You can find the So there's power on both sides.
Yeah. What really surprises me is that any or every decision the Bank of England made about QE was accepted first by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who signed.
Yeah.
Who signed the amount and who...
Well, they leave it to the experts. It makes it easy to then turn against the experts who made the wrong choices. But if you go on the Bank of England website, you have swathes of communication tips on how to communicate on QE. How do you explain to the people what it is?
I remember Theresa May criticizing during a convention Mark Carney and saying that the Bank of England was responsible for some inequality, indeed social inequality, and he answered back that
so it suits them. They don't take the political responsibility. But you're right, in fact,
which is not true.
That's not true. Yeah, they do choose.
They make the rules and then they accept and they sign.
Yeah.
So that leads me to my next question about people. Isn't there here a big matter of person and personality? The way what the bank does may be more or less accepted according to the personality of the governor. And I think the Carney's period was, of course, a difficult period because it was the period of financial crisis and recession. But at the same time, he might have been so charismatic and he was communicating a lot. And so people more or less accepted and did not see what you've just talked about. That is to say, the risk on inequality in society.
I mean, there's no
more now, maybe
there's no evil motive behind this. This was what all central banks did, to combat low inflation.
But the consequence that we could actually guess very quickly, because we realized that banks were recapitalizing and keeping the money, and that the money was not going to the people. So we
it's not
rapidly,
but wealthy people.
Wealthy people,
yes, remain
also the banks when this was done. But you're right. Also, wealthy
so talking
people.
about personalities. I studied those speeches, the Mansion House speeches, since 1946, and I use textometry, and it's very interesting to see how Mark Carney is off the scale. Very, very different in content and style, and even the words themselves. The delivery style. This is Britain. It's not America. The delivery is fairly monotone. It's money. You discuss money, so there is a certain gravitas that comes with that. But yes, you find a wealth of interesting references in terms of metaphors, and he refers to a different world to Britain. It's really a departure from the more traditional British speech, and with Andrew Bailey, you see a return to the British banker. So that period was not an easy one. However, he managed it fairly well. It's not just down to luck. He had 2 referenda. As I said, he was the only person addressing the UK the day after the referendum. But yes, you're right. There was that was part. Having said that, we still have a limited pool of governors they choose from. They haven't yet taken much risk in terms of diversity.
Yes. Okay. So couldn't they try to find, even they do not have a big pool of candidates, potential governors, could the government try to have a figure which would help at the moment, help the population?
No, but there's one is staying.
Yes, he's staying, but they have not that long terms or
I think
mandates.
there used to be 5-year terms, which were renewed once, except one. I mentioned clashes with PM, so he didn't renew. But now it's 8-year. So they usually outlast governments. So they're like really stable. Should they go for the whenever a mandate reaches its end, there is a job ad in The Economist. If you wish to apply, it's open to all. Although George Osborne went out of his way to secure Mark Carney, there was a prolonged,
I remember that. So maybe they did not choose the right person. If there are so many, as you've just said. And I could.
I mean, we're not there to lay the blame on the central banks, but it's there seemed to be groupthink. It seems like all central banks applied QE, and therefore, and despite the fact it's not working, they seem to have run out of instruments.
But we can see that there are some protests. You talked about protests during the
there was
the speech. So.
In fact, what I've noticed is that since
protests,
I studied the Mansion House speech from 1946 to today. In fact, I pay attention to this year's Mansion House speech as well, and it's very interesting to see that it has taken place without interruption till 2016, and then from 2016 onwards, on the 16th of June 2016, Joe Cox was murdered, and so that was the day the banquet was going to go ahead. They replaced it with an homage to Joe Cox. The following year, the banquet was supposed to go ahead at the time of the same time the Grenfell fire, the Grenfell Tower fire was burning, so it looked out of place to carry on with this event. In 2020, because of COVID, it was cancelled, purely and simply. So there's been quite a lot of disruption with that event. So that says a lot about, and the long name I showed you has now been toned down. It's for professional and financial services. So we've removed, it's only 2 years ago, but merchant and bankers no longer feature in that title. And it's more diverse in terms of the people who dined there, because in the 60s it was just men. In fact, further back it was men and their wives than just men, because they can only fit in 300 people in that banqueting hall. But there's a lot to be said. Sorry, I don't.
No, please.
No. As in terms of, you're wondering about the power and the message and communication,
and the protest and the people who are starting understanding what a central bank can do to them or against them. And so I was
I think
wondering.
at the end of the day, the buck stops with politicians. You know, they, as you said, they are responsible, and in fact more so in Britain than elsewhere, because they set the 2% inflation, whereas the ECB is totally independent. They set the inflation rate, so they have a say.
Yeah.
Maybe they should,
and by
be more accountable.
Yeah, and by nominating this particular governor, who is, as you said, more conservative in the way he presents things. But this might not have been a good choice, because we now have a very new generation.
For a central bank, you're looking for a safe pair of hands. You often hear that saying, somebody who knows, who's risen from the ranks.
Okay.
That the city trusts. Mark Carney was an odd choice for the Bank of England, because he's former Goldman Sachs.
But it worked.
And it worked, but as you say, that's when QE started.
Yes, okay. The last slide you displayed, from this last slide, I understood that, to be very quick, finance, the sector, the people, the Bank of England sort of influenced what society is today in the UK. And I was thinking, and vice versa. I'm always interested in the question of structure and agent. So,
well, the Bank of England adapts to age, obviously. So they do a lot on diversity within their ranks.
Yes,
actually, they communicate a lot on that. And I am told by experts, economists, that they do a lot more than the Banque de France or the ECB or the Fed. So they are, pioneering these type of changes. They are aware that they're not in an ivory tower.
Okay, so they're pioneering these changes,
but not at the top,
because yes, because they as a central bank for the other central banks. Oh, but do they reflect society changes, or has this big financial sector, which is so important in the UK, influenced the rest of society?
Well, you hear sometimes, is it worth it? The British people themselves wonder this overblown financial sector. But that's, the counter argument is the figures we saw at the beginning, that it funds, that was an old, an old argument. It funds the NHS. So they're more or less trapped. They no longer make heavy goods. It's not manufacturing countries, as many Western countries. Fintech seems to be the next, industry they try to position themselves in. So the idea would be, yes, to produce something else than financial services. But because of these gains, political leaders loathe attacking. And what you see with Rachel Reeves from the Labour Party is actually quite telling. She that's a departure from Jeremy Corbyn. She is Bank of England herself. Actually, many politicians these days have had a stint at the Bank of England, so they've also risen from the ranks. And the idea is to, restore a trust in institutions. That institution, there needs to be that dialogue.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop with my questions because we have guests today, many listeners with us and also online. So maybe we have questions in the room. Yes, please. We'll have to speak very loudly because I'm not sure they...
Of the story, obviously not having learned much about its history, but it appears that since central banking independence was invented, I'm looking from a political perspective, it was very convenient, because saying that we have an inflation targeted central bank that's independent from political pressure can keep borrowing costs down, because now we have monetary stability in our country. And the moment borrowing costs were no longer down, it was sort of not ended, but circumvented with QE, saying that, okay, you're not printing money, but you are buying government bonds. And I just wanted to ask, how did it look like in history? So from the beginning of creating central banking as an idea, was it as obvious always, or was it, when did the ban on monetary financing even start? It's an idea.
Sorry, when did the ban?
The idea that you're not supposed to print money to finance the government. So when did it emerge as an idea for the banking union? Was it from the beginning, and was it politically?
When you say from the beginning, we've started in 1692. We're not talking about the kind of finance that you have here, but they certainly were a bank of credit. They lent money. You know, there was about £1 million lent to the monarchs for, I think it was an 8% rate payback. So this has gradually opened, you know, central banking has become more sophisticated over time, but we can't really discuss central banking as we know it now from the early days. You know, this has gradually evolved. Well, it is the banker to the state.
Other questions? Yes, Balkis.
Recent years, particularly in context of Brexit. So, for you, how has populism intersected with the blend of conservatism and liberalism that you explained at the beginning of your talk? Are you referring to the intra-party reforms and transformations within the Conservative Party that you mentioned a number of times? And here I'm referring to the post-2005 era and David Cameron's, including the party's shift into a more entrepreneurial style that you find with Cameron's big society and empowerment rhetoric. I mean, when you say that there is a blend of conservatism and liberalism, are you referring to
Small L, small c? I'm referring to currents and how because the Bank of England is above politics, so there will be no allegiance to the Conservative Party as such. So no. So conservative in the sense it is a very conservative small c institution. It tends to be a late mover, you know, with the times. If you look at the ERM crisis, for instance, it was because they joined the exchange rate mechanism late that they eventually had to crash out of the ERM. So they were, you know.
I'm going to agree with you on that. So,
so they were not. I mean,
no, but I'm not going to intervene.
It's because we had that discussion the other day.
We could start a new debate. Right?
So yes, I was not referring to political parties at all. No, small c. Maybe that was at the beginning of sentence with a capital C. No. It's just that it's to do with the targets. Finance and the establishments are often the target of populist attacks, and that was never from usually inside the party. So, I mean, if you look at Boris Johnson, and I'm not repeat the word what he said about business, or Jeremy Corbyn, the approach was slightly more antagonistic with business and finance than it is today. There seems to be an appeal to returning to, you know, more appeased times and dialogue.
Do we have other questions in the room? Yes.
We've talked with that, and you've touched on the fact that essentially there is always this tension between the City of London's tendency to focus on microeconomic topics, whereas sort of perhaps a state where it's more driven by macroeconomic concerns, including growth and development stuff like that. Has there ever been a situation where these two tensions, these two sort of conflicting interests, conceptions even of how to do things, ever came really resulted in a sort of a tension between what essentially the city and the financial sector in general in the city of London, and what, for example, Prime Minister's plan or promises have been. That's very good questions. And in terms of, we talked about how heads of the banks of England are chosen. I'm really curious, has there ever been sort of, because we know, for example, that in France and the US, the heads of the Bank of America and Bank of France are usually more political. They are more because they rely more on political sort of favors to get a position. In France, it's a de facto appointment by the government. And in the US, it's they have to sort of come in front of Congress, sort of justify why they sort of should stay in position. Has there ever been sort of that question in Britain where a head of central bank, the central bank had to sort of align politically or justify the position politically?
Okay, so as regards your first question, the city pursues its own interests. They were by and large Remainers, for instance, and they've lost access to the single market and passporting rights, and that's a huge blow to businesses. And so they would not agree with the official line, and they're still trying to come to terms with it and finding ways around it. But there is certainly no, discussion or agreement prior to that. The city is very much pursuing, its own international interests. As regards the appointment of the governor, so if I look at the period I've studied, specifically for my PhD, that's 1946 onwards, they were all merchant bankers. So it was their kudos, their experience in the city that, and plus, at the beginning they knew Montagu Norman, etc. So they're all lords, in fact. All the first names, Lord Cobbold, Lord Cromer, Baring standard like the perfect appointment, merchant family. In fact, he's the one who only stayed one term and refused to renew his mandate. Thereafter, when merchant banking waned, there was around the 60s a more meritocratic turn when governors actually were more taken from the ranks of the Bank of England. So that's still the case today. They tend to have, made their way up from the lower echelons of the Bank of England and served, as is the case for the current governor, Andrew Bailey. He's served at the he's been head of the Financial Conduct Authority, which is another government body. So they've usually have been in office elsewhere. But again, there's no political affiliation, very unlike France. It's not a political appointment. It's got to be somebody that the city trusts normally.
Other questions from the room? Yes.
I have a very general question here. I was relatively surprised that the Bank of England here would be so important in your depiction of UK finance in general. But what wasn't so clear to me was the relation between the two, in the sense that you made it relatively clear that sometimes central banks are contra governments, especially left-wing weak government that may be tempted to increase public spending, and they have the central bank reminded them that you have to protect the value of the sterling. But what about the finance? For me, there is a strong break in the 1930s with the financial crisis, in which economists like John Maynard Keynes begin to see the central banks not just as financial institutions, but as the sort of lender of last resort, and that because of this role, they become a bit contra financial market as well. They need to sort of control the creation and development of relatively uncontrollable, crazy assets, very complicated derived assets like complicated insurance scheme and stuff of that sort. And I would like to know what was in the long period that relation. I mean, not just in the 20th century, but before the crisis. Was there sort of, because that's kind of interesting. I really like the picture that you made of the two Londons in some way. There's government's London versus the financial place. But what about the Bank of England in this depiction? Is it on the side of government in that case, the sense that it is a bit contra financial market, or is it more on the side of the financial market?
So it is firmly on the side of the financial market, but it has a role in regulating them as well. So it's there. It's got all these powers back now to regulate banks, to regulate markets. But I mean, through history, what we've seen, I mean, you can't really compare what they're doing now to what they were doing in the 30s. I'm less of an expert about the 1930s, but they've had their powers taken away from them, returned to them. Their role is definitely to regulate, so they're there to encourage, to obviously they promote the city abroad. There's a Lord Mayor who's an ambassador. They also have people in Parliament, so that the laws, you know, are scrutinised by the city. So that the bank sits atop all this large community, which is now international. So the idea is to attract business to London, but also make sure that they're able to combat, I don't know, rogue banks. You know, in the 1990s in particular, the BCCI scandal was just on their doorstep. It was the bank they had authorized. And because of, you know, light touch regulation, this has become one of the, you know, biggest scandal in terms of what the bank was doing, you know, arms trafficking, etc. Again, there. So these days, they take a very cautious look at, you know, how operations. I mean, the idea is not to turn London into these days Singapore on Thames. You know, it's not a free for all. The idea is there are rules, and despite the fact they're out of the EU, you know, there are, you know, certain rules and codes apply. So they are a bit of both, really. They are certainly firmly in the city, but they have a close link with governments. They're like the transition, you know, the connection between the two.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Maybe online? I can see we have several people who are connected. We have 9 people, so maybe we have a question. Yes, I think I can see Catherine's just.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very, very interesting lecture, which explains a lot about the way in which the whole thing has worked out. Now, I've got a question about what do you think the future holds, especially with what will probably be a general election bringing into power the Labour Party. And you mentioned Rachel Reeves' lectures, and I was wondering how you stood, how you felt that her lecture was either well received, of course, on the left or in the centre left, and rather badly received on the conservative right, and how you felt about this. I mean, personally, I did feel that the whole speech was very much a lecture on the ways in which finance and the financial market had been working in terms of political and economic theory. But I'd be very interested to know how you feel about this.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, It was a very different speech from the ones we've heard so far from Labour, and I think the most frequent occurrence in that speech was stability. So stabilize, restabilize. You know, every single line has stability in it. So it's a very strong message, both to the business and finance community that you'll see some stability in the future. That's very much for them. That message was aimed at them, but beyond the city, I think there is among the British public and a perception that that's what's lacking, and a craving for political stability as well. So I think this was aimed at two publics in a way, restoring some form of stability. Now, how that is received by, because Labour Party, Conservative Party are broad churches, there will be always elements who feel that that's not a Labour speech. This is going against the grain. That's that may not please all the factions within the two large parties, but that's where Keir Starmer's going. Stability. So it might be a transition, but that's the message, and that seems to be working fairly well so far. So they may not change that particular message.
Thank you very much.
Do we have other questions from the people who are online? Do not hesitate to switch on your camera so that we can see you, and switch on your microphone and talk. No?
I was thinking just this is interesting from Catherine's last question, where the Conservative Party, in order to gain votes and return, is trying tax cuts, thinking that usually works with the British public, but that doesn't seem to have shifted polls. So that
what to the next?
That's not. But the stability message and return to some kind of deference to the institutions, and the constitution seems to be working better at the present time.
Yes, because it was really threatened, jeopardized. This constitution it's been in the past.
Well, you could say
8 years.
Yeah, you could say from New Labour onwards, there's been quite a few changes to the constitution.
Yes,
and that included the Bank of England.
Okay. Thank you very much, Laurence Harris, for this presentation.
Thank you,
was
Nathalie.
Really interesting. I think the audience here, the public we have in person, and the people who are online, we can see Stéphan Porion and Catherine Marchal here as well. So they were the co-organizers of this seminar. We also have with us Yann Giraud, who also co-organized, and as well as Balkis, who is one of the student
PhD member.
Yes, exactly. So thank you very much. We will stop the seminars for now for a certain time. We'll be busy with research and other activities. And then we meet again in September for new sessions of this seminar. Thank you very much, Catherine, for your big work on this seminar. Thank you, Stéphan, for your big work on this seminar. And see you after this long period of research and work and papers to correct, etc., etc. See you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.